So we pick up developments now after the First World War, and we left off. This is actually a slide that we already saw. That at the end of the Paris Peace Conference, it was determined that the Arab territories of the former Ottoman Empire would be designated mandates. And if you recall, in theory, a mandate was not a colony. These territories would be under the authority of one of the great powers. In the case, what would constitute Syria, inclusive of Lebanon, would be under French control, and what today constitutes Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan would be under British control. You might recall Jordan, or back then they called it Transjordan, was considered initially part of Palestine. And so, in practice, I mean, they very much were like colonies, but the great powers were supposed to prepare them for eventual independence. And the reason why we have the territories designated by Sykes-Picot alongside of it is to kind of show that which territories went to who very much reflected respective British and French interests. Now, when you think about it, you might imagine, well, okay, it's not ideal, but eventually they will become independent. There are two problems with this. First of all, there's no timetable. There's no indication at which point any of these mandates should be made independent. It's entirely at the discretion of the French and British, respectively. And they really never work out exactly what being independent means, right? And we already saw what happened in Egypt when the British unilaterally make Egypt independent. This is roughly around the same time, where, in theory they're independent, but in actual fact the British maintain control of many aspects of Egyptian policy, foreign policy, defensive policy, the military, various institutions and aspects of government, and so forth. So you really can't speak of it as being real independence. Now, in theory, the whole mandate system is under the overview of the League of Nations, a newly created international body. And so the British and French are obligated to report periodically on progress being made. But the League is never really going to challenge them, either the British or the French, regarding anything they report, regarding whatever indication they give as far as how prepared the Arab people are for independence and so forth. But, I mean, from this point on, we can talk of each of these mandates as constituting a distinct state. And of course, this is where the modern borders of the Middle East are created. So looking first at Syria. This is a modern map of Syria, though some of you know that right now Syria is undergoing a civil war. So the actual extent of the authority of the central government is problematic. But in any event, initially it would have included Lebanon. Lebanon was seen as part of Syria. And you might remember I mentioned that the Arab revolt at some point had managed to take control of Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. This was under Faisal ibn Hussein, who we see here at the Paris Peace Conference as head of the Arab delegation, with his friend T.E. Lawrence. And so they had actually set up, in theory, a provisional independent Arab government under his leadership, even while they made the case at the Paris Peace Conference that the great powers and the international community should recognize Arab independence in Syria, complete unfettered independence. In the end, decisions were made rather to support the French claims in the area. And so what actually ended up happening is after the British military withdrew, they had occupied Syria during the war, the French military came in and pretty much drove Faisal and the Provisional Arab government out of Damascus and took over. And one of the first things they did is carved out what would become Lebanon. So they created the state, and we say Greater Lebanon because the basic rationale for creating a Lebanese state was kind of the argument that the Christian Maronite population there was somehow a distinct people, that they weren't really Arab. They did have kind of historic ties with the French and with the Catholic Church. But the thing is, if you were really going to create a state, for the Maronite Christians, supposedly inclusive of territories where they actually resided, it probably only would have included the area immediately around Mount Lebanon, a much smaller area than what was actually created. And so, kind of the rationale was that a Maronite state in the territories that were purely Maronite would be too small to be sustainable, and therefore is necessary to actually enlarge the state to include what you might call the hinterland, where there were economic and cultural ties. The problem with that is by doing that, you actually incorporated large numbers of non-Christians into this new state, both large populations of Sunni and Shia Muslims, none of whom wanted to be part of a Maronite-dominated Lebanese state, and all of whom pretty much consider themselves to be, in some fashion, Syrian. So, the Maronite Christians, in a sense, the state was created for them. And just a reminder about who they are, right? So they constitute a distinct sect of Christianity. They have many of their own rituals, liturgical language, and so forth. But they do recognize the authority of the Pope. So they're Catholic, but they're not what we call Latin Catholics, right? Or Roman Catholics, which is kind of more the mainstream of Catholicism. They did have, again, strong ties with France politically and culturally. You might recall there had been a massacre of Maronites by Druze, D-R-U-Z-E, which is another group that has a sizable population in this newly created Lebanese state. At which point the French had sent the military in to intervene on their behalf. So they did have kind of long-standing ties with the French. And the French definitely felt that by supporting a Maronite state, or at least a Maronite-dominated state, it would provide a pretext for maintaining a foot in the region. Right? But again, I mean, they were actually concentrated primarily around the Mount Lebanon. And so this is pretty much what you ended up with. A Lebanon with a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of ethnicity and religion, and so as coded here, right? You can see, certainly certain territories are definitely predominantly Maronite, but then you have large areas where you have other groups, including other Christians, right? But definitely Sunni Muslims, and I would really highlight the kind of dark pink, which represents areas where Shiite Muslims are very dominant. And that is going to become a factor later on, leading up to the Lebanese Civil War. I should note, too, that it's not just about religion or ethnicity. For instance, Maronites, other Christians, and Sunnis tend to be more urban-based, tend to be kind of more engaged in commerce, and tend to be wealthier, more well-educated. Shiites tend to be, particularly early on, we're mostly talking about a kind of peasant population. Very often, as the state develops, they're going to feel very often left out. Meanwhile, back in Syria, the idea again is that eventually Syria should be made independent. And the French seem very reluctant to actually bring that about. So eventually we start to see a kind of Syrian nationalist movement evolve. Probably the dominant figure in that is going to be Hashim al-Attasi, who had been a prime minister under King Faisal when you had this very kind of short-lived provisional Arab government. And later on, he'll be elected Syria's first president in 1936. And that doesn't mean that the French were actually out by then. But at some point, they did agree to a kind of, at least some form of Syrian independence, some kind of partial independence, related to which they established a parliament and the office of presidency and so forth. But then later on, the French actually backed off on what they had agreed. In 1939, al-Attasi ended up resigning, basically, as a consequence of that, when the French refused to live up to their pledge to grant Syria partial independence and withdraw its troops. I would just, in fairness to the French, point out the year 1939, well, that is, Europe is on the brink of war. And at that point, the French government decided that they had more important and pressing issues to deal with and were very reluctant to create a, kind of a unstable situation in their colonial territories in the Middle East. So eventually war did break out. And so initially, Syria ended up being under the control of Vichy France, which is a kind of puppet government created by the Nazis. But eventually, it was liberated by the British Army with French, I guess you might say, freedom fighters. In 1941, they attempted to gain the support of the Syrian people by promising that immediately following the war, they would be given independence. Again, the French resisted honoring their pledge. And so even at some point attacking the Syrian parliament building in Damascus, so this is after the war, May 29th, 1945, this led to widespread demonstrations throughout Syria. And it very quickly became clear that the Syrian people just wanted the French out, no matter what that might entail. What probably really did cause the French to withdraw in the end was international pressure. And so, this is kind of now we're entering a period where colonialism is considered to be completely wrong. And so, particularly through the United Nations, but in other respects, a lot of pressure for colonial powers to relinquish their control. So the last French soldier actually leaves Syria on April 17th, 1946, which comes to mark Syria's National Day, kind of day of independence, if you will. Now, the French imagined that, they weren't welcomed in Syria, but they certainly thought they'd be much more welcome in Lebanon. But it ends up being kind of the same story. So after Lebanon is liberated by the Free French, elections are planned. They talk about independence after the war. But the Lebanese government that's created at that point decides not even to wait that long. On November 8th, 1943, they unilaterally abolish the mandate. The French respond by throwing the new government into prison, but again, with international pressure, they eventually relent. These individuals are released from prison, and Lebanon is granted its independence. Now, this might surprise some people. It certainly surprised the French because the consideration is that the Maronites, at the very least, would want to see the French remain as a way of, kind of ensuring that their state or the Lebanese state remained independent. But a lot had happened in the interim, and eventually the three largest religious groups, the Shiites, Sunni, and Maronites, were able to come together and negotiate an agreement about how to govern Lebanon as what we call a multi-confessional state. Confessional here referring to religious identity, right? So the idea that they're going to acknowledge that divisions based on religion actually matter, but is there a way that they can cooperate to actually run the state? So they come up with something called the National Pact. And this is very important. I really make note of this, and this is going to be a key factor right up until today in terms of any attempt at kind of finding a modus vivendi for how to live together. It's an unwritten agreement, which doesn't mean that it's not official, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't have very specific provisions. So some of the highlights. First of all, the Maronites indicate that they will never seek foreign intervention, and they accept the idea that Lebanon is in fact an Arab state of some kind, not a Western one. But in return, both Shiites and Sunnis agree to give up their aspiration to unite with Syria. Fine, we accept Lebanon as an independent state if you accept that it is in essence an Arab state and part of the region. They also agree on how to allocate seats in the parliament, with the idea that Maronites would have the most seats. This is based on a census that was taken in 1932, which showed that the Maronites had a slight majority relative to any other group. Not an absolute majority, but there were more Maronites than any other single group. I would point out there's never been a census taken since then, partly because the Maronites have resisted that, and it's generally believed that's because they know that it would show that the Maronites no longer constitute the biggest group. That's kind of the arrangement with the parliament, but then they also kind of arrange on how to allocate the most important offices in government. The President of the Republic, and that is the most important and most powerful position, would always be a Maronite. The Prime Minister would always be a Sunni, but would be appointed by the President. The title they often use, President of the Council of Ministers. So it's a very important position, and so it has to be a Sunni, but it has to be someone that the Maronite president is comfortable with. President of the National Assembly will always be a Shiite, and then you go down the line where each religious group is given some kind of position in the government. For instance, Deputy Speaker of the Parliament would always be a Greek Orthodox. That brings us to the mandate for Iraq. So a number of things about Iraq that we should consider. First of all, during the Ottoman period, there was no administrative unit, district, province called Iraq. So in some ways, it's a somewhat created state where they took three different regions that in many ways are distinct to create kind of a new unified state. Having said that, I mean, it isn't that there wasn't any kind of traffic going on between these areas or kind of sense of connection. But nonetheless, there are certain distinctions, and that would possibly be a factor later on with respect to conflict. So first of all, in the north, which is more mountainous, you have a large Kurdish population, predominantly Sunni. And then in the center, you would have predominantly Sunni Arab population. That's kind of a much more level terrain. And then it's kind of coming down towards the Persian Gulf, where it also is very level but also a bit marshy. You have a large Shiite Arab population, right? So let's be clear about that. Arab, ethnically, linguistically, but Shiite. And then we might note that you actually have other populations, rather sizable ones, non-Muslim ones like Syrian and Nestorian Christians, and a very large Jewish population, particularly in Baghdad, where actually they made up, at this point, the largest single group, right? So not an absolute majority, but there were more Jews than any other specific religious group in Baghdad. So this is a British mandate. And so the British decide to create a constitutional monarchy form of government, and they even know who they really want to be king. So they somewhat install Faisal. This was the same Faisal who'd been driven out of France, who led the Arab revolt and had been the head of the Arab delegation in France. And some would argue the British felt a little guilty about not supporting their claims in Syria, so this was kind of a compensation. The problem was, from Faisal's point of view, is he's not from Iraq, he's from Arabia. So he was, kind of a hero of the Arab revolt. They have kind of a plebiscite or, referendum, a vote in the country, whether they would support him as monarch, and he wins. But he has no connections of his own in Iraq. On the other hand, from the British point of view, that's great, right? Because really he's entirely dependent on the British in order to maintain his position. And so by having him on the throne, the British feel that their interests will be pretty well served in the region. So that's kind of what they set up in Iraq, and it actually becomes, in some fashion, independent almost immediately, but with a tremendous level of British control. It's very much like what we have in Egypt, right, where the British are actually kind of the commanding officers of the Iraqi army are British. You have British military bases there. The British have a great deal to say about, any kind of policy, particularly defensive or foreign policy, and so on. Now, the British did a few other things in order to ensure that one particular group would dominate politically. And this is actually a very typical ploy of the British in colonial rule, right? Whenever you go into a place, maybe there are different groups there divided by ethnicity or religion or language, and you pick one. And then you arrange things to ensure that that particular group is kind of in charge, and that group then also feels a bit dependent on the British and tend to cooperate with them and to promote British interests. In this case, they the group they choose is the Sunni Arab population, that they should be the dominant element. And so they initiate a number of measures to kind of make sure that the Sunni element is dominant, and particularly kind of the more elite members of the Sunni Arab group, right? So you have the Land Settlement Act, which basically allows Sunni tribal sheikhs to register what are effectively tribal lands in their own names, right? So large swaths of territory that had belonged to entire communities now belong to single individuals, making them very wealthy, making them politically dominant. They actually come to constitute the political elite. There is the tribal disputes regulations that further strengthen Sunni tribal sheikhs in terms of judiciary rights, that they're actually the guys kind of running the courts and settling any kind of judicial issue. And at the same time, they do things to undermine the position of peasants, right? So you have the Peasants' Rights and Duties Act, which severely reduces the rights of tenants. So effectively, what the British have done here is create a political elite that they feel to some degree will be beholden to the British. And what are British interests in Iraq? Well, Iraq's location is seen as very strategic with respect to the Persian Gulf and India. It isn't about oil initially. It's probably more about India, right? Because they just want to make sure that all pathways to India are in British hands. But eventually, oil is discovered. Earlier in the north, around Kirkuk, Kurdish territory, and almost immediately the oil rights, exploration rights to be more precise, are granted to the British-dominated Iraqi Petroleum Company. Don't let the name fool you, it's a British company. But in effect, with control of Iraq and Palestine, the British have a land bridge connecting the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Right? So this is seen as, from the perspective of British imperial interests, as an ideal situation. So Faisal, proves to be somewhat blah as a leader. I mean, but initially it looks like things are kind of working. Unfortunately, Faisal dies at a pretty young age. He becomes ill, dies in a hospital in Switzerland. In 1933, he's succeeded by his son Ghazi, who rules until 1939. Ghazi had kind of a reputation as a playboy, and was into kind of chasing women around, driving fast cars, and so forth. Well, he ends up dying in a motor car accident, at which point rule goes to his cousin and brother-in-law, the Crown Prince Abd al-Ilah, largely because Ghazi's son at that point is just simply too young to govern. And during this time, you have just within the parliament this constant rotation of these political elites, constantly changing hands, generally promoting their own self-interest over those of Iraq. And part of the problem is it's going to take some time to really forge a sense of a unified Iraqi identity, right? And kind of a sense of civic duty to the well-being of that state and its people. And that brings us to Palestine. And the mandate for Palestine also is a British mandate, like Iraq, a little different from the others. So yes, on the one hand, the British have an obligation to prepare the indigenous people, Palestinian Arabs, we might say at this point, I think, for eventual self-governance and independence. On the other hand, the terms of the Balfour Declaration are actually incorporated into the mandate, meaning that they're also recognized internationally, even at the level of the League of Nations. Right, so there we have the Balfour Declaration to remind us, what is the mandate then include? The creation of a national home for the Jewish people. But what does that mean in actual practice? Right, I mean, that sounds very nice as an ideal. What it means in practice, and this is pretty much decided early on, two things. One, to facilitate the immigration of Jews to Palestine. Right, so it's kind of the idea that the British government has an obligation to allow, later on there'll be some arguments about what should be the, should there be a cutoff point at some point, like over a certain number should it be permitted, but generally speaking, unlimited Jewish immigration to Palestine. Secondly, that it should be facilitated the ability of Jews to purchase land. And so during this period, during the period of the mandate, Zionism in large measure is about trying to acquire through purchase as much land as possible. And this is going to often have a very negative economic impact on Palestinians. Very often when large estates are purchased, for instance, peasants being driven off the land and so forth. So, apart from the fact that there's also the political concern, and many Palestinian Arabs are not too keen on the idea that right before their eyes they see the fashioning of a Jewish state on their land. Now, British authority is basically corresponds to the position of High Commissioner of Palestine. The first High Commissioner, Sir Herbert Samuel, Well, right there, you're going to kind of understand that the British are very much committed to supporting the creation of a Jewish national home. Sir Herbert Samuel is English, but he's also Jewish, and he's also a strong supporter of Zionism. Now, having said that, he does take great pains to show that he's even-handed, to try to demonstrate his neutrality as far as mediating between Zionist and Arab interests. But for many Palestinian Arabs, this is a pretty clear message about whose side the British are on. Now, having said that, the period of his commissionership is relatively peaceful. But I would argue that largely that reflects a number of factors that have little to do with him. First of all, initially, you don't see really huge numbers of Jews going over there. So at the start of the mandate, about 10% of the population is Jewish. So it's still not clear, how realistic a threat this is. Also, at this point, Palestinian Arabs primarily try to address this through peaceful protest demonstrations, sending delegations to London and so forth, writing letters of petition. There really is a belief that if they can only convince the British of the injustice of what they're doing, that they'll change their policy. And in spite of the fact that the British very often make it clear that that's not the case. So for instance, at some point, one of the first Arab delegations from Palestine to go to London, when they met with the colonial secretary, a fellow named Winston Churchill at the time, who some of you may have heard of, even before they can open their mouths, he basically tells them that they can just forget about the British altering their policy in this regard, almost in humiliating fashion. What does become clear is there is tremendous confusion in Palestine about exactly what the end goal is. What is a Jewish national home? And in fact, it gets so bad that at some point the colonial secretary himself is going to travel to Palestine, with T.E. Lawrence, by the way, to try and clarify what a Jewish national home is. By the time Churchill is done, he has people even more confused than beforehand. And that might be by design. I'm pretty sure if Winston Churchill, who had a great command of the English language, if he wanted to clarify matters, could have done so. This actually led to a kind of statement of British policy in 1922, part of which actually severed off the Transjordan from the rest of Palestine. So that's kind of when that split took place. And so a number of things connected with that. First of all, what this meant is that all territory east of the Jordan River was off limits to Zionism. Jews couldn't settle there, they couldn't purchase land there. Secondly, they put Abdullah bin Hussein, the brother of Faisal, in charge of his administration. It would seem he was about to actually lead an attack on the French after Faisal had been thrown out of Damascus. So this might have been a way for the British to kind of, calm him down and placate him and say, well, listen, we'll set you up in Amman, what will become the capital of Jordan, and you will administer this territory. And he would hold the rank of Emir, or Prince of Transjordan, even while it was under British mandate. Jordan would finally become independent under his rule in 1946 as the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, with him taking the title of king. Meanwhile, back in Palestine, probably a turning point in terms of Jewish-Arab relations was the Wailing Wall riots of August 1929. So, I want to be clear, right? The conflict in its origin is primarily about two competing nationalisms for the same territory of land. But religion does get pulled into it, often in connection with what is the holiest site in Judaism, and the third holiest site in Islam, and that would be the Temple Mount / Haram al-Sharif, right? So we see, you're probably familiar with the images, right? The Haram al-Sharif supposedly commemorating the place from where Muhammad commenced his night journey, at least that portion of it where he went up to heaven and communed with the prophets and with God and so forth. And so that became the third holiest site in Islam. But it is also the site of the original Jewish temple going back to the Roman period. The Romans had actually destroyed it, so that really all that remained were some parts of the retaining wall. One of those walls, the Western Wall, became very important in Judaism as a site of worship, at some point a tradition developing that the presence of God could be located there. And so Jews would frequently go to pray there. And throughout much of the history of the Ottoman period, Muslims and Jews were able to go about their business relatively peacefully. But this did start to become a kind of site of contention during the British Mandatory period. And you started to see demonstrations and counter demonstrations around it, but not around religion, more, kind of viewing the site as a kind of national monument, you might say. Eventually, a rumor began to spread that the Jews had the intention of taking over the whole Haram al-Sharif, and this just kind of led to an explosion at one point in August of 1929. So after a service at the main mosque on the Haram al-Sharif, many Muslims came out greatly agitated and ended up massacring large numbers of Jews, especially in Jerusalem and the neighboring city of Hebron. At the end, 133 Jews were killed, 339 were injured, and 110 Arabs were killed by British police, with 232 Arabs injured. The British responded by sending a commission to try and determine the causes of the riots, and they basically determined that they were largely nationalist in origin and that they were spontaneous. And so here we see the images on the left. That's on the top of the Temple Mount, probably one of the most famous monuments in the world, the Dome of the Rock. And then on the other side, you see the Western Wall, which is kind of just below the Dome of the Rock. It's a retaining wall kind of around the platform that makes up the Haram al-Sharif, and it's a place that many Jews go to worship. From that point on, it became pretty clear that, like somehow finding a way for Jews and Arabs in Palestine to peacefully coexist probably wasn't going to happen. Now, at some point, Palestine's Arabs came to the conclusion that the real problem wasn't the Jews in a way, it was really the British and British policy. And it was pretty clear that peaceful means of protesting and demonstrating against British policy in this regard was